I was actually surprised about how little the debate actually covered economic topics. Where you look at all of the polling, it says economic issues are the most important things that are going to drive undecided voters' votes in the election. One is the economy, and two is inflation. I'm not sure how
Kind of go
inflation
hand in
is
hand.
not part of the economy. But I think we got far less of a real substantive dialogue on those topics than I would have hoped and expected. And I also thought that there was really very peripheral conversation around China, which I also might have expected, given the important issues that our country faces with its greatest competitor.
We did get some conversation on tariffs, and Donald Trump did push back on what we heard from Kamala Harris in that clip just now by saying that the Biden administration did leave intact some of the tariffs that the Trump administration had put on China. What are your thoughts around those types of protectionist trade policies?
It's interesting, Tim. Actually, both parties are really largely aligned on tariffs and trade, actually. There are, of course, some nuances. Former President Trump is doubling down on his reasonably aggressive, trade stance. What he said, at least, was he would implement tariffs of 10 to 20% across the board and 60% on goods coming in from China with a broad brush. I don't think that's particularly effective. To be sure, tariffs have an important place to protect industry, U.S. industry, where those industries are critical to our national security interests. But when you do it on a broad brushed basis, at least it's my view, that the light's not worth the candle, because clearly it's inflationary. I think it actually costs you more jobs than it saves you, and costs get passed on to the consumer. And frankly, there are a lot of industries where we are just not competing effectively on a global basis, and as a result, taxing those goods coming in is just bad for U.S. consumers and is inflationary.
So it's not apples to apples in terms of what Donald Trump is proposing now, Stefan, in terms of more Chinese goods that are coming in versus what we've seen during the Trump administration, what continued into the Biden administration, specifically on high tech and chips in particular. So it's not the same thing.
Well, the tariffs, let's separate. One of the things the Biden administration did was export controls as it relates to chips and critical technology. But specifically as it relates to tariffs, this started with steel production. And the issue around state-owned enterprises in China, which control steel production and now are by far the leading producer of steel around the world and have flooded the market. The fact is, President Trump put on tariffs for imported steel from China. The fact is the Biden administration kept those tariffs, but the fact is China's behavior has not changed. And so the question always should become in these circumstances, was it effective?
Right.
And at least so far in changing Chinese behavior as it relates to steel, it hasn't been effective. And in fact, it's gotten in many ways worse because the Chinese economy has slowed, and as a result, their domestic consumption of steel has gone down. And what's happened to all that steel that continues to be produced? It's being sent overseas, driving down prices and creating real global instability in that steel in the steel market.
You did mention the economy and inflation, two things that we know, thanks to poll after poll, are on the top of mind for voters. We learned a little bit more about Kamala Harris last night, but still, since she's relatively new as a candidate and doesn't have a full policy position out there, we don't know everything about how she feels about this stuff. Some of her other policies that she's unveiled in recent weeks include no taxing tips. She's come out with that. First-time home buyers getting some sort of home buying credit, expansion of the child tax credit, supporting small businesses, we learned in recent weeks, with tax cuts there.
But let's go through a couple of those, Tim.
Yeah,
So,
I want to talk specifically about the home buying one.
The home buying one to me is interesting, and you didn't mention obviously the whole price gouging,
price gouging
issue
as
that
well.
she raised, because to me these both reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of reasonably simple economics, right? Which is if you give somebody $25,000 to go buy a first home, and there is frankly not a demand issue but a supply issue, let me tell you what's going to happen. That curve goes up, and houses are going to cost $25,000 more.
Basic
Right.
economics.
Basic economics.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how that works and does what she wants to do, which is to actually assist new home buyers in affording their first terms, what it's going to do is just increase the prices